Díobh dinarch dem kinse taulen in Kevris Nowith Enwis Disco Chernowick Warlinen. I'm hoping this will be part of a long series of Cornish language lessons online, which I'll be posting on YouTube. I'm recording this right now from my home in Hawaii, and since I'm about 11 hours behind everybody in Cornwall and 6 hours behind people on the East Coast of the United States, I'm probably not going to have a lot of opportunities to do live teaching about Cornish grammar, but I did want to make some lessons available as downloadable YouTube videos, in particular dealing with some points of grammar that may not be covered in a lot of the regular courses and textbooks, and also to let people know about some of the things that are out there in terms of resources for people studying Cornish. And also some of the things that come up in the traditional text that might be useful to know when you're writing and speaking Cornish, ways that we can make our use of Cornish sound a little bit more natural and use some of the idioms and ways of speaking that seem to have been common for people who had Cornish as their community language in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and beyond. This course is mainly going to be using SWF in the Middle Cornish forms, which is the variety of Cornish that I study. And I want to say this first lesson, which is about the pluperfect and conditional tenses, was inspired by my dear friend Trelawney Grenfell-Muir, who more than anybody else has gotten me back involved in the Cornish language in the last couple of years. And I really appreciate everything Trelawney's been doing to help promote Cornish in North America and around the world and online, which I think is a great opportunity for us right now to come together as a community, even though we're scattered all over the world. So a few days ago, Trelawney told me she had the opportunity to be part of a Zoom course in Cornish that dealt with the conditional and pluperfect tenses. And she mentioned that she had a couple of questions that came up about that and was interested in finding out a little bit more about the grammar of those tenses, how they're used. And it occurred to me, these are really important forms to learn if you want to take your Cornish to the next level, beyond just sort of saying what you're doing right now, what you did yesterday, what you're planning to do tomorrow. Using the conditional and the pluperfect give us the opportunity to do better writing in Cornish, but also to talk about things in more nuanced and interesting ways. So it seemed to me that a good place to start is looking at the conjugated endings that we use for some of the main tenses in Cornish. In particular, I separated out the 4 indicative verb tenses. So indicative in linguistics basically just means it's talking about stuff that actually happens. That's as opposed to the imperative, which is where you're telling people what to do, or the subjunctive, which is where you're talking about stuff that may or may not actually happen or that's hypothetical. So in the indicative, we have 4 verb forms in Cornish. And the 2 that you're probably most familiar with are going to be these first 2 here. So the present future, which is used to refer to things that either happen habitually, like they happen all the time at the present time, so like something you do every day, or they're going to happen in the future. It isn't the form that you would use if you were talking about something you're doing right now at the present. If you're going to do that, you would say something like ama, he, o, keusel. She is talking. That means she's doing it right now. She's not going to do it in the future. It means it's happening right in the present time. And you'll notice in that case, the verb keusel isn't getting conjugated. It's actually the verbal noun with a particle in front of it that makes it into the present participle, the ing form, as we would say in English. So the verb that's actually being conjugated there is the verb bos, and that shows up in the present future tense as ema, which means is. But this is not the form that I'm talking about when I say present future. The other tense that you've probably encountered already is the preterite tense, which is the main past tense that we have in Cornish. And it's also related to the present tense. It's kind of like the present future is used for anything that didn't happen in the past, and the preterite tense is used for things that did happen in the past. You can think of it as past, which is here, and non-past, which is here. So the preterite tense is equivalent to the English verb ending ed, which we put on verbs like I walked, I talked, I studied. And again, it's one of the first tenses you use in Cornish, so much so that many people go on to use it as basically the only past tense in Cornish, which is not a good idea because Cornish actually gives you two other options. And those are the imperfect and the conditional or pluperfect tenses. And these refer to different kinds of actions that can happen in the past. So we'll talk about exactly how they're used a little bit later on. One of the things I want to start by discussing, though, is the forms. Now, you may notice if you take a look at the present future tense, the first and second and third person plural forms are in, och, and ons. And we see in the preterite or perfect, we get very similar looking forms, sin, so, and sons. In fact, the only difference between the two tenses here is that basically you're adding an S before the conjugated endings. And that is the main difference between the plural forms of the present future and the plural form of the preterite. Similarly, you can see a little bit of that going on with the second person singular because you also get this form ses, which is kind of like putting an S in front of the second singular ending. And I should mention that at least in some later Cornish, you do get is as a second person singular present future ending, even though the usual Middle Cornish form that we learn is if. For the first and third person singular and for the impersonal form, we don't get that same relationship, but I should point out in the preterite tense, all of those forms end in an S. So S is really the marker that we should think about for a past tense in Cornish relative to a tense that is not as far in the past. Present future is stuff that didn't happen in the past. If we want to talk about stuff that did, we add an S before we put the ending. Turning to the imperfect then, if we take a look at the imperfect tense, one of the first things you may notice is that the endings look a lot like, or at least many of them look a lot like the conjugated forms of bos, the verb to be, in the imperfect. That's actually the case with en, es, in, out, and ends. Those are all conjugated forms of bos in the short form. A is very much like the o, which you find in the short form of bos in the past, in the imperfect tense. But of course, because it's unstressed as an ending, it gets reduced to a. And interestingly, the impersonal form is, that's actually the same as the past participle ending, which is why the impersonal form of the imperfect is usually the same as the past participle. But we don't need to go into the impersonal today. That's definitely a subject for another lesson. Now, you may be aware, if you've studied Wella Brown's grammar or one of the other grammar books for Cornish, that there's also a kind of alternate set of endings for the imperfect. And they show up in these four cases, the singular forms and the first person plural. And here the vowel is a little bit different. It's an I or an E instead of an E or an A. The verbs that do that are verbs that have a verbal noun ending, in L or E or S plus a number of others, and you just have to learn them. But in general, you should definitely think of these green ones, NSA, NL, NS, is, as kind of the standard regular verb endings for the imperfect. So how is the imperfect used? Well, the imperfect is used not for things that happen one time in the past, where you're just saying, oh, it's over, it's done. They're used for things that are habitual actions in the past or ongoing actions. So you would use the imperfect in cases where you want to say that you were doing something or you did something a lot in the past, like I went to the park every day last week, or I was going to the park when I got a phone call. The imperfect tense is what we use to talk about basically the same types of things that we would use the present future tense for, but the imperfect tense is used when those things happened already. They happened in the past. They're not happening in the present or the future. And that brings us to the conditional or pluperfect. And here, I just want to point out, we have the exact same relationship that we saw between the present, future, and the preterite, which is to say the endings of the conditional or pluperfect tense are the same as the imperfect, but they have this added s at the beginning. So you end up with sen, ses, sa, sen, seu, sens, and ses as your endings. It's basically the same as the regular forms of the imperfect, but with an s stuck in front of it. And that's because originally this tense was used as a pluperfect, which means a past tense that's even further back than the regular past. In English, this would be the tense where you would say things like, I had done that already. Like, it's not like I did my homework, but I had already done it before I went to class. So you're referring to an action in the past. I went to class. That would be the preterite or perfect. I went to class, preterite tense, but I had already done my homework earlier than that, even further back in the past. So again, when you take a tense and you make it more past, you're going to do that by adding an S to indicate that it's more far back in the past. And we have this wonderful parallel between these two sets of tenses. So present future versus preterite and imperfect versus pluperfect. There's one other thing that I want to talk about before we move on, and that has to do with what exactly is meant by this form, which is when we say preterite versus perfect. So those are actually two tenses. So just like the present future refers to something that is either present or future, preterite and perfect are really two different tenses that happen to use the same set of endings. And which one you're using is determined by which particle you put it with. So if we're talking about positive statements in Cornish, usually we use either the preverbal particle e, or we use the relative particle a. So we'd say something like heddiw e skrifis diso, today I wrote to you, or mi a skrifas diso, I wrote to you. And which one of these we use is determined by the order of words in the sentence. But these are both particles that are used in affirmative sentences. If I'm saying a negative sentence, I want to use a different particle, and that will be the particle ni, or if it's a relative sentence, na. So, ni skrifis vi, lyther heddiw, I didn't write a letter today. Hen you lither na skrifis vi. That is a letter that I did not write. These are the negative forms. Now, these forms are preterite, used with the preterite tense to refer to actions you either did do or did not do in the past. However, if you want to specifically say, instead of I did it, I have done it. So in English, sometimes we say, I ate dinner, or we say, I have eaten dinner. And which one you pick is determined by what you're trying to say. So I ate dinner is sort of, I'm just giving you a list of stuff I did today. I went to, I went for a walk, I came home, I had dinner, I watched TV. But when you use the perfect tense, which is kind of the have done form, versus the preterite tense, which is the did form in the past, it's more important to emphasize that you've already finished doing it. So if you say, I have gone for a walk, the implication is, yeah, I already did that. I don't need to do it again. I have eaten dinner, so thanks for suggesting it, but I'm not hungry. I have read that book, so I don't need to read it again right now. Now in Cornish, unlike in English we have two totally different forms. We say I did it or I have done it. There's no way to mix them up. They're very different. In Cornish, we use the exact same verb form. But we can distinguish between them because if we want to mark something as being perfect rather than preterite, instead of using the particle e or the particle a in the affirmative, we use the particle re, which is called the perfective particle. And that just means it turns did into have done. So if I were to say a sentence like, for example, let's see, we'll use me a skrifas lither. That means I wrote a letter. But if I were to say me re skrifas, and I'm going to mix this up a little bit and say an lither, that actually means I have written the letter. It means it's already done. I already finished it. In English, you change the whole way you say the verb. In Cornish, you just replace one particle with another. This is great if you're making an affirmative sentence, but if you're making a negative sentence, unfortunately, Cornish doesn't give you that option. The negative form of those is ni skrifis vi lither, which is I didn't write a letter, or I have not written a letter, and ni skrifis vi an lither, which is either I did not write the letter or I have not written the letter. In other words, the particle ni, and for that matter, the particle na, these particles cannot be replaced by re. It's not allowed. Re is only used in affirmative sentences, and that's why the perfect tense, I guess you can think of it as kind of being in parentheses. It's only able to be used in very limited ways. And it's always associated when it is used with this perfective particle re. That brings us to the imperfect and the conditional or pluperfect. So pluperfect is, as I said before, it's this tense that means basically I had done something. Like I did something, but before that I had already done something else. It's like the perfect, but for the past. In English, they also call it the past perfect as opposed to the present perfect, which is this one. This is the past perfect. It is very rare in Cornish in the traditional text. It really only shows up mainly in the very oldest ones, like Pashanak and Arluth has some examples of it. When it occurs, you use these conjugated endings, but you can, and this is interesting because it's optional, you can put re, the perfective particle, in front of them to indicate it's pluperfect and not conditional. If you leave that particle out, or if you're using a negative sentence where you don't have the option of using re, you actually don't know whether what you have is conditional or whether it's pluperfect. So, for example, let's take the verb skrifa again. If you were to say me a skrif sa on lither, that would be I had written the letter. If you want to be very specific that you mean I had done it, you're allowed to substitute the a with the perfective particle re. So me re skrifsa an letter, I had written the letter. But if we want to make this sentence negative, the only way to do it is me skrif sen vi an letter. You can't tell that that's pluperfect because there's no re particle. Again, the re particle can't coexist with a negative. You can only use it in a positive. And that leads to the question, well, what can this mean besides the pluperfect? And the answer is, this is the form you use not just for the pluperfect, the had done form, but for the conditional, which in English, we tend to think of the conditional as meaning the would do form. Now that's interesting because I said indicative means tense is about stuff that actually happens, things that actually happen now, things that already happened, things that happened a lot, things that happened way, way, way in the past. The conditional isn't any of those things. The conditional is what would happen if something else happened. And it's a later development in Cornish that came out of the pluperfect tense. And I want to talk a little bit about why when we learn in our classes that this is the tense you use when you want to say the equivalent of the English would, that's a really great way to learn it when you first start learning it. But if you take that lesson too much to heart, you're going to end up making mistakes with your spoken and written Cornish because it sometimes is true and it sometimes isn't. There's basically 4 tenses that I want to talk about, and these aren't the same as those conjugated verb tenses I discussed before. These are ways of using those conjugated verb forms to convey different types of information about actions that happened or might happen. So the first of these is what we call the habitual imperfect. So habitual meaning it happens often or continuously or repeatedly, and it's imperfect because it happened in the past. In English, one way to put this is I would write, like when I was a kid, I would write in my diary every day. We can also say I used to write, but it's important to remember that would in English can sometimes be used to refer to this kind of used to, something you did a lot in the past. It isn't referring to the future. It isn't referring to something that could happen if something else came to pass. It's a different use of would. And it's really an imperfect tense. In fact, if you studied French, the equivalent tense is something they call the imparfait, which means the imperfect. And in Cornish, you would also use the imperfect tense, mi a skrifa. Or if you prefer to use an auxiliary verb, mi a re skrifa. And by the way, the verb re, which is the imperfect third singular of the verb dio, is your friend. If you don't want to conjugate verbs in the imperfect, you say mi a re and then the verbal noun. So you can say mi a skrifa or mi a re skrifa. And that means either I would write or I used to write. Then we have a couple of other uses of would in English. So one of them is what you could think of as, we call it often the secondary future. So that really means the future in the past, a future, but relative to something that happened in the past. So I said that I would write the letter. Now you don't know whether the letter's already been written or not, but the important thing is you are saying that the writing of the letter was later than something else you already talked about. I said, past tense or preterite in Cornish, that I would write it sometime in the future after that point. In French, you would use a tense called the conditionnel, the conditional tense. But in Cornish, you use the imperfect for that as well. And this is a real problem because we're taught in Cornish the conditional or pluperfect tense, that is this one here, that is the would form. But the problem is you can see that there are already two ways we use would in English that don't match up with the conditional or pluperfect in Cornish. If you're saying, every day I would write in my diary, you would use the imperfect in Cornish. That's this one. And if you would say, I said that I would write you after I finished my homework, you would use, again, the imperfect. That refers to the future and the past. And remember, that's a little bit like the habitual or future meaning that we associate with the present tense. And again, if you prefer to use an auxiliary verb, you can say mi avrei scrifa for this one as well. So these two tenses, these very much look to us like they should be conditional, because in English we use the would for those, but they're not the conditional tense in Cornish. We use the imperfect tense for these, and that's really important to remember. Where we do use the conditional or pluperfect form is when we are actually talking about a condition. So the example of that is, and this is the true conditional, what would happen if something else happened? In other words, if a particular condition were met. And that would be a sentence like, if I were fluent in Cornish, I would write lots of books. Now, in a way, that's talking about a future event, but it's not talking about something that already happened in the past, like a habitual imperfect. And it's not really talking about a definite future. It's saying what you would do if a certain condition, that is, I learned Cornish, would happen. Then I would write books in Cornish. In French, they call this tense the conditionnel, and they use it for that. And in Cornish, we use the conditional / pluperfect, like basically the form that we were looking at with the S-E-N, S-E-S endings, the ones that have an additional S in them. Those are used for the conditional. And you would say either mia skrifsa, liver, I would write a book, or mia ryssa skrifa lither. So again, the verb grussa or mia ryssa is your friend. If you don't like to conjugate verbs in the conditional, you can just say grussa, which is the third person singular viol in the conditional. Finally, we have the pluperfect. Now in English, the pluperfect is really different. Instead of I would write, meaning I used to do it all the time, or I would write like I said I would, or I would write if something happened, we have I had written. That's really obviously a different form. In French, similarly, they have something called the pluperfect, the plus que parfait, that's used. And again, I had written. It's literally word for word the same thing as the English. I had, that's the avait, and écrit, written. In Cornish, however, we use the same form for the pluperfect, meaning I did it before something that happened in the past, and for I would do it if a condition is met. The only thing that's a little tricky about this is And again, rusa is the form you want to use if you're using gul as your auxiliary. If you're using a pluperfect rather than a conditional, and pluperfect is the one that actually means I had done something. If you want to use that form in particular, you're allowed to distinguish that, at least in affirmative statements, by adding in that re particle instead of a or I. Mi reskrivsa liver. I had written a book. Mi rusa skriva liver. I had written a book, or I had done the writing of a book, literally. So the reason I put English, French, and Cornish here is I wanted to just point out it's very difficult when you're dealing with a language that isn't your native language to match up certain things that just break down in a different way. So if you learn the idea that the conditional in Cornish is like I would in English, which is generally a good rule of thumb, like if you're going to say, if I won the lottery, I would endow the Cornish language partnership with lots of money. That's a correct equivalence of conditional. If something happened, then I would do X, Y, and Z. But since English also uses would for things that you used to do and things that you will do, but relative to a time in the past rather than the present, it's a mistake to use the conditional form, the skrifsa form, if you're talking about stuff like that. Instead, you have to remember to use the imperfect. If you're a French speaker, that'll make perfect sense here, where you're talking about something you used to do all the time in the past. But if you're a French speaker, it might be a little confusing because here French and English both use the same form, but Cornish lumps the idea of a secondary future, future in the past, together with habitual action in the past. And that's very similar to what we see with the present future tense. It's either something I do all the time now or something I will do in the future from now. That's the present future. And the imperfect is either something I did all the time in the past, I used to do it a lot, or something I would do in the past after another event was over. Where Cornish is very different from a lot of languages that we either speak or have studied is that whereas English and French are really careful to make a distinction between conditional and pluperfect, I would write or I had written, j'écrirais or j'avais écrit. In Cornish, we actually use the same form for both. It's always clear from the context, by the way, whether you're talking about something that is a conditional statement, like if this happened, I would do this, versus I had done it. There's never any confusion because you don't use those verbs in the same context. Like if you're using a conditional statement, there's usually going to be something earlier on that has a word for if in it. And pluperfect, you're usually going to have something earlier on that has a preterite tense or some other past tense in it, that the pluperfect is earlier than. Thank you for joining me to learn a little bit more about the past tenses in Cornish, in particular the conditional and pluperfect and how it's used, and also a little bit about how the imperfect tense is used. I would love to see these tenses become more popular in people's writing and speech and revive Cornish. Because they are a part of the traditional language, and also they're pretty cool, and they definitely reflect some of the ways that Cornish is very different from English, very different from French, very different from a lot of other languages that you're likely to have studied. Once again, Muraz Lehui, Chonsta Gans Agastudianzo and Tavis Kernowick and Terminade. And hopefully this will just be the first of many podcasts. So thanks so much and take care. Nosta Lehui.